Good morning to you all, and welcome to this very special event where we launch the next Welsh Youth Parliament election campaign as part of the Eisteddfod 2021, Eisteddfod T as it's known. It will hopefully be an interesting and stimulating debate on democracy in Wales. It's a very exciting time for democracy, and we'll also be discussing young people's engagement with democracy in Wales over the past few years, and also looking to the future in terms of how that relationship will develop. My name is Siôn Jenkins. I work as a journalist, correspondent, presenter for ITV Wales here in Cardiff. I work on Wales at 6, the news programme, and also present current affairs programmes on S4C, Y Byd ar Bedwar, and Ein Byd as was. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I look forward to this discussion. But before we begin, I do have a few things that I should mention. Firstly, this event will be held through the medium of Welsh, but it is possible for you to watch it with simultaneous interpretation by going to the second link that's already been shared with you.
In Welsh, but it is possible for you to watch it with English translation by clicking on the second link that should have already been shared with you. Felly, fel o'n i'n sôn, mae'r digwyddiad hwn yn
So, as I mentioned, this is a starting point for a series of events that will be staged in order to launch the second Welsh Youth Parliament election campaign. And if you use social media, then please share as much as possible in terms of the information about this launch, because it is a very exciting time for young people, the length and breadth of Wales. In Wales, youth representation in politics and democracy has changed substantially over the past few years. As you all know, an election for the Senedd was held last month, and that was the first election in Wales where young people at 16 and 17 years of age could vote for the very first time. So that was a piece of history, and we saw young people becoming more engaged and more vocal in campaigning on those issues that are important to them. And that's happened increasingly over recent years, including things such as the climate strike, for example. But the Welsh Parliament did launch the first Welsh Youth Parliament back in 2018, and as some of our panelists will know, 60 young people came together from all parts of Wales to give young people a stronger voice at a national level. And they prioritised a number of issues, including things such as emotional and mental health support, and I chaired an excellent debate on that issue with you last year, and also issues such as littering and plastic waste, and the importance of life skills in the new curriculum in calling for change. But most importantly, I think the Youth Parliament held the Welsh Government to account and stood up for young people across the country. And the first Welsh Youth Parliament came to an end in March of this year, and this event, as I mentioned, launches the next election period for the second term of the Welsh Youth Parliament. So there will be some new faces in the next Youth Parliament. And as I mentioned, joining me this morning, I have a panel of 4 young people. No, not 4, we have 5. 5 young people from different backgrounds and different areas of Wales who in many different ways have engaged with young people on democracy, and they have their finger on the pulse, if you like, in terms of the relationship between young people and democracy in Wales and those issues which are very important to them. So before we begin our panel discussion in earnest, could I ask you to introduce yourselves? So give us your name, where you're from, where you live, and just give us a little bit of information about your interest in politics and democracy and what you've been doing to engage with young people in Wales. So if I could start with Kai, if you could introduce yourself. Yes, good morning. My name is Kai Phillips, and I live on a dairy farm near Blaenau in Carmarthenshire. I am very interested in politics, and I've just concluded my A-level studies at Ysbydd and hoping to study media and international relations at Aberystwyth University. And during the election campaign, I was campaigning and encouraging young people to register and vote in that election. Excellent, thank you, Kai. Aleena. Hi, I'm Aleena Khan. I'm in Cardiff, and I've always been interested in politics because as a non-white person, I didn't feel that I had the same opportunities. So my father was always teaching me about politics and the importance of trying to do more in that area. Excellent. Tom. Hi, my name's Tom. I live in Cardiff, and I've always had huge interest in politics. I am from Cardiff, so there are a number of Senedd-related events close to home, and I'm now studying politics, philosophy and economy in Queen's University, Belfast. And during the election campaign of 2021, I co-founded 5M Cymru Wales, and our aim was to ensure that young people across Wales could really engage with politics and find their role in the new modern politics of Wales. Excellent. Talulah, welcome. Hi, my name's Talulah. I'm from North Wales and I'm a former Welsh Youth Parliament member for Clwyd South, and I'm studying history at Cambridge University. I've been campaigning to increase the participation of young people in politics, and I've also been campaigning on issues related to mental health and emotional support in schools. Excellent. Finally, Lleucu. Hi, I'm Lleucu Non. I'm from the Nantlle Valley, and I am studying professional Welsh at Aberystwyth University at the moment. In terms of my campaigning, I would say that I've always had an interest in politics. It's something that my mother encouraged very much as I was growing up, particularly with the stigma at that time where young people were seen as not having enough interest in issues, and I've been contributing vlogs and blogs and conversations for Lush Cymru on young people and democracy. Excellent. Thank you all very much and welcome. I look forward to the discussion. As I mentioned, if you have anything to say, then don't be shy, jump in there, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion this morning. So we'll move on immediately to that discussion and to the first discussion point. And if we can set some sort of context in a way, it does appear that young people are more engaged and participating more in democracy in many different ways now, as we've seen have been staged over recent years. And as I mentioned, we've just had the first Senedd election in Wales where young people at 16 and 17 years old had the right to vote for the very first time. So given all of that, what do you think about the current status in terms of the relationship between young people and democracy in Wales? Where are we at the moment? Are we in a good place? Are we in a healthy place? Tom, if I could start with you, given what you've been doing with 5M Cymru Wales, what's your view? How do you see things? Well, it's something of a mixed bag, I think. I think the energy is out there. Young people really are interested in issues around climate change, education. We saw a number of protests on exam grades last summer. So the energy is certainly out there. The problem I've seen, and I think every one of us have been working to change this, is that there is a gap between young people in the grassroots who are very concerned about issues related to young people, but don't really see that their aspirations for the future are reflected in the Senedd and in our national political scene. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's a great deal of energy, but I don't think that there's enough representation around young people's issues in our national political life. Lleucu, as one who's been encouraging more engagement, do you agree with Tom? Do you think that it is a mixed bag as he described it? Yes, certainly. And as someone who's just started in university, I saw a huge difference between university and school in terms of how much interest there was in politics and how much conversation around politics was taking place. And as Tom mentioned, the energy is there. And I think what's also arisen as a result of the establishment of the Welsh Youth Parliament is that young people have come to understand that we're not properly represented at the moment in policy and in political parties. And I think some parties have responded to that to a certain extent, but there is some shift happening. And I think this is the point personally, and I think the more campaigning that we can do, then the more young people will be inspired to realize that they need to seek resources or information in order to understand how policies work and how the political parties affect them.
Swn i'n deud union yr un peth.
I would echo that, certainly. There has been a shift over the past year, particularly, I think, as we've seen international affairs dominating our screens, essentially, because I think the concept of social media activism and digital advocacy has certainly increased as we see the huge issues happening across the world. Black Lives Matter, Kill the Bill, and so on and so forth. We've seen more young people being vocal, but as Tom and Lleucu have said, I think there is a gap there in terms of how young people engage with these issues. I think because of the lack of faith that many young people have in government and in those people, encourage young people to contribute to that system where they feel that the system has essentially failed them, and it's failed them because of the system. And then they turn to external groups. And personally, that's what I do. I've lost faith to a certain extent, and therefore we turn to groups where we feel we are being represented. So I think that lack of representation is still a problem. And as Lleucu said, this is a starting point. Well, we're very fortunate to have you, Talulah and Kai, as former members of the Welsh Parliament with us this morning, and in a way that Youth Parliament has been working to be some sort of bridge over that divide that you mentioned. So Kai, has that bridge been sufficiently effective? Do you feel that you've been able to be an advocate for young people, to help them to engage and to see the value of democracy and how it impacts upon them? I certainly think so, yes. I've spoken to friends who perhaps didn't discuss politics before, but when I became a member of the Youth Parliament, they engaged more. And it was disappointing how many young people had registered to vote. I think it was 46%. But in looking at things optimistically, the schools were closed because of the pandemic. They couldn't get that political education that they needed. So if we look to the next election, where we won't have a pandemic, hopefully, then hopefully that percentage will be higher and there will be more enthusiastic conversation among young people. Aleena, do you feel that there is a divide between young people and what's happening in terms of action, that the voice of young people is being heard? Well, as one who's a little older, I'm 23, when I was your age and I was participating in Cardiff Youth Council and so on, I did feel that there was a huge divide. So we had ideas such as vote at 16, but I never felt that that was really translated into actual change. So it's nice to see that Wales and organisations such as the Youth Parliament are trying to make a difference, but I'm always worried about diversity among those people participating. Now, what kind of people, what age are there, what level of diversity is there? Because again, as a person of colour, I always feel that there is a lack of representation of young people of colour, and we do have problems that are specific to us. So it would be nice for people like us to have an opportunity to make a difference. I think many people would agree with you, Aleena, that getting more people of colour to engage with politics and to have their voices heard is one of the challenges that we need to address. But to open it out a little more broadly to you all, what do you think is the greatest challenge that needs to be addressed in order to strengthen that link between democracy and young people? I know that there are numerous challenges, including the one that you've just mentioned, Aleena, but what do you think about those other challenges? What needs to be done to encourage young people to see that democracy impacts their daily lives? And I'll throw that question out there, and do jump in, one of you. Well, if I could go first, I'll try not to sound like a politics student, but I always describe it during the Senedd campaign particularly as exclusion leading to apathy. It's that divide that we discussed, young people feeling that there is that gap between them and politics and the policy that's developed at a national level, and that leads to apathy. Young people, as we've seen with the protests of last summer, time and time again, do place their faith in social movements, and very often they feel that nothing actually changes. So their hopes are eroded time and time again. So I think we need to see, particularly with the Youth Parliament, we have an excellent platform to really use those protests and the issues that are important to young people, and to see real change at a policy level, which will impact the lives of young people across Wales. Anyone else have any contribution to make in terms of the challenges that we need to overcome in order to encourage more engagement with democracy in Wales? I would say that one of the massive challenges is a lack of education. And although there is digital education available, I think it is very important that we do ensure that the education that people receive is accurate and representative of the current status of the political system. And I think it is difficult because when young people understand that politics and issues are very layered, for example, climate justice, talked to racial justice and all sorts of other areas, and that's a huge number of challenges, and it links into what Tom was talking about in terms of this apathy. Many young people do feel hopeless and apathetic, and in order to engage with that, then I think the concept of care is hugely important. And I think if we have education and a care for each other coming together within our schools and in youth groups, then that's how we can tackle this problem of hopelessness and apathy. It's by caring for each other. I think that's how that can happen. Well, it'll be interesting to see how the new curriculum develops here in Wales, and I think we'll discuss that later, but it will be interesting to see how political education comes into the equation there. Lleucu, I think you were about to come in. Well, I was going to say exactly what Talulah said, to be honest. Education, and I know that I've left secondary school now, so I don't know what the latest developments are. I'm not going through that experience myself at the moment, but I do remember feeling as a school pupil that I was learning about politics at home, and that when I got to school, that awareness wasn't shared by the vast majority of other pupils. And I do recall when the general election for Westminster came at the end of 2019, I didn't have a vote because I was a few months too young, and that was very frustrating. I won't go into that. But there were people who had a vote that didn't know how the general election worked. And I felt a great deal of frustration because I wanted young people to vote, but it was also frustrating knowing that young people had the vote, but they didn't have the necessary education. And as Talulah said, the media are an excellent resource, but another challenge around that is to know what's valid and what's reliable. And that's where education can be so useful in school, so that young people know, well, these are the kinds of sources that provide you with real information, because we have seen in election campaigns that the media can be quite dangerous in terms of the facts it provides. And also, in terms of children growing up in poverty, then perhaps the media isn't a resource that's available to them. Perhaps it isn't accessible to them. So education, I think, is a resource, or is a way of educating children from all backgrounds and all ages, because you need to start with children in years till they're 16, and so that they can analyze politics or can analyze what politicians say and come to their own view, because that skill of coming to an opinion is already out there for young people, or we wouldn't have the Youth Parliament. But one of the challenges, I think, is that they should learn about politics that does impact upon them and that they understand what they're voting for. Yes, I think many people would agree with you on that. Before we move on to our next topic, I just want to throw one question out there. There was talk there about young people getting involved with movements or organizations before they see the value of political parties or politics more broadly, be that something like Black Lives Matter or Yes Cymru, for example. Why do you think young people do tend, and I think there are some facts underpinning this, young people do tend to gravitate towards movements rather than political parties? Is that something that you've experienced yourselves? And if so, why is that the case? Why do you think young people tend to do that and see value in movements rather than politics and politicians? I've certainly seen that myself. I think young people do focus on single issues very often, and I think political parties don't appeal to young people because perhaps the age profiles that they see within political parties isn't something that they can get on board with. And I think that things can happen in political parties where young people believe that that wouldn't be appropriate for them or wouldn't be of interest to them. I also think that there is a preconception that groups such as the Youth Parliament or any youth group doesn't really make a difference, because historically, I personally haven't seen a translation between the policies that I've drawn up within youth groups with what's actually delivered. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed too. Sorry to butt in there, but although we're discussing this divide between young people and national policy, I would always argue that we are the smartest, most political savvy generation. I discussed this with my parents and I said, well, when you were my age, you were discussing where you're going to go shopping today, and we're discussing things like racial justice and the climate and our future. So, as I said, the energy is out there, and I think these movements are the best way for us to translate that into action. I also think that within our generation, you're right, Tom, that the conversation has changed. There's been a shift, and there is more discussion now about the failings of the current system. And that's all related to different authorities and governments. And there's the fact that the system is inherently colonial and inherently racist, etc., etc. So when we, as young people, identify that, we don't want to play any part in it. It doesn't make any sense to us. So people do turn to movements. They're creating their own movements where we see that we're represented and we see the kind of politics we want to see incorporated into the system, but it just isn't there yet because of that generational divide. If I could just jump in quickly, I would also say that in terms of movements, they are far more clearly defined in terms of their aims and objectives. Where if we look at political parties, as Talulah said, there is no representation, and perhaps we don't see our demographic being impacted by politics, not until recently, perhaps. And there is so much ambiguity in policy, as Talulah said, it's so multi-layered, and that's what causes the apathy, where organizations such as Yes Cymru and Black Lives Matter, the aims and objectives are so clearly set out in terms of what they want to achieve. And also, they've reached out to young people from the outset. They've realized that we are aware of what's happening, not only because of the media, but also because we see the world more clearly as compared to previous generations. I think that's certainly an issue too. Yes, I think it is fair to say that it's easier for movements to focus on single issues, where politicians and political parties do have to cover a number of different issues simultaneously, which might confuse things. But I think it'll be interesting to see how that relationship between political parties and political movements does develop over the coming years. But if we can move on to another discussion point. Aleena, you mentioned that there is a preconception that anything with the title youth doesn't actually deliver. But of course, the Youth Parliament, the Welsh Youth Parliament, does provide a voice for young people at a national level, and it is a platform for young people a platform for young people run by young people, and they choose the issues that they want to focus on and are important to young people, and provide a voice for young people across Wales. And if I could just explain briefly what the Youth Parliament is, then there are 40 Youth Parliament members elected as constituency members. They are elected in an online election. And then there are 20 additional members elected through partner organisations in order to ensure representation from diverse groups of young people, and as I mentioned, two of you have been members, and you made history in a way as members of the very first Youth Parliament here in Wales. So if we could just look at the Youth Parliament. Now, again, it's quite a general question, but why is the Welsh Youth Parliament important, and what role can the Welsh Youth Parliament and the young people elected to that parliament, what role can it play in terms of that link between democracy and young people? Kai and Talulah, we'll start with you because you have been there and done it, if you like. How important is that role that you yourselves have played as members of the Welsh Youth Parliament?
Mae'n rôl pwysig iawn herwydd.
Well, it's a hugely important role because young people do need to see other young people out there fighting for the issues that are important to them. And I do think that the way in which the Youth Parliament works, it works very closely with the Welsh Parliament as a whole. And I do think that we've seen that politicians can work with young people, and I think that's very positive, I think. Talulah, why did you decide to stand for election as a member of the Welsh Youth Parliament? Well, initially, I was interested in learning about the political system, and I wanted to see how things worked on the ground. So it was very useful for me to see what it was like to work within the system. But the way I look at the Youth Parliament is, it's probably changed now, and I really would like to see more scrutiny of government through the Youth Parliament. Clearly, there's collaboration, but we need to keep that element of scrutiny on government, and we need to ensure that they do discuss the issues that we put forward to them through our reports and so on, and that they really do listen to our views. And I think we need more feedback from them on those issues. So it's all well and good having pictures taken together and say, oh, well, yes, we're all working together. But I think it is very important to see that tangible material change that happens as a result of that collaboration and those conversations. Before I open that out, sorry, Talulah, if I could just ask you, did you feel that the politicians did appreciate your work and listen to you? Did you feel that that was the case? Yes. There were many times when I did feel that that was the case, but on occasion you do feel that it was a box-ticking exercise in terms of youth participation, and people would set up a meeting with you and say, oh, I really want to hear what you have to say, but then that was done, you don't hear from them again. So I think that is a problem. And as we move forward, I think it would be really nice to see that change in terms of the way in which members of the Senedd do respond to Youth Parliament members. And Tom, Lleucu and Aleena, you weren't members of the Youth Parliament. Did you see any value in the Youth Parliament? Did you hear other people in your age group discussing the Youth Parliament? Were they aware that such a thing existed even? What did people outside the Youth Parliament say?
Well, digwydd bod nes I sefyll I fod yn rhan o'r Senedd.
Well, as it happened, I did stand for election to the Youth Parliament, and I did my best to raise awareness within my school so that people were aware that a Youth Parliament was being established, and that was the first step indeed. And also for them to feel that it was possible for them to vote as young people and that their voices would be heard. Brengain won that seat, and I was very, very pleased for her. She was a far better candidate than me, to be honest. But having seen the Youth Parliament established and when all the members were elected, I heard far more about the Youth Parliament through the media because I personally took such an interest in it. And as I said earlier, this is the starting point, but I did hope that the Youth Parliament would continue, and I'm pleased that it is continuing. Having heard more about it, I didn't hear that much myself, if I'm honest, but it depends who you're talking to. If you're having conversations with people who have the same interest as you, then you do hear about it, but it depends on who you talk to. There are some people for whom politics hasn't left its mark on them, and they haven't really considered what the role of politics is in their lives. But certainly over the past few weeks, and to be honest, during that period where there were rumours that we were to have the vote at 16, there was far more talk, there was far more conversation around issues. And then with the protests around exam degrees in August, which was a very frustrating time for us. But otherwise, I think during the election campaign, I did hear a little more about what was happening because there was such a campaign to encourage young people to vote for the first time. And although the numbers were lower than we'd hoped for, there was a great deal more conversation around the issue. And during that period after the first Welsh Youth Parliament election and when COVID struck, we didn't hear too much about it, if I'm perfectly honest. But as I said, it depends on who you talk to. And we've already said a number of times during this discussion that everything that we've done over the past few years is an excellent starting point. And I also stood for election and my best friend won against me, and she deserved it far more than me too. But the Youth Parliament is excellent as a starting point to encourage people to participate in our democracy, as we saw during the election, but there's a great deal still to do. But it will be excellent for the future too. And Aleena, before we move on, you mentioned that you're 23, so a little older than the others, but not as old as me. But what would be the one thing that you would want to see change in terms of the Youth Parliament? Or what's the one thing that needs to be done to that's about to begin? I feel a little disappointed that I'd not heard about the Youth Parliament because the circles I'm involved with are with the mosque and with non-white people, and to hear and the fact that I've not heard about this and the fact that you have friends that have been discussing the Youth Parliament and you've been involved, then it does show that we do need to do more to raise awareness among a wider network of people to encourage their involvement. And with movements such as Black Lives Matter and so on, it does show that young people of colour, people who are white, those with disabilities, do participate in politics and democracy, and they want to do that. There is just that gap in terms of knowing how to do that and how to get involved. Now, Brexit was one of the first votes I cast, and at that time, there was a great deal of energy around campaigning. There was a great deal of excitement in terms of participation in politics, and following that, I experienced some racism, and many other people did too, and we lost interest, perhaps not lost interest, but how can I say this? We didn't feel that politics represented us So we perhaps were less engaged. And so it's important with Black Lives Matter and the energy around all of that, it's important that we do have that diversity and attract that diversity to represent us within the Youth Parliament.
Well, yeah, fel o'n i'n sôn, bydd hi
Excellent. And as I mentioned, it will be possible for young people between 11 and 18 to put themselves forward for election for the next Welsh Youth Parliament election from the beginning of July, which is next month, and any young person between 11 and 18 can also register to vote in that next election. And that registration opens today, and you can register to vote online by going through the Youth Parliament website, which is www.youthparliament.wales, or there is more information on how to do all of that on the social media pages of the Welsh Youth Parliament too. But before we move on to the questions from our audience, Kai and Talulah, just very briefly, what would you say to any young person who's considering putting themselves forward for election to the Welsh Youth Parliament? And why do you think it's important that young people do register to vote in the next election? Kai and Talulah. Oh, I think it's crucial that young people register to vote first and also stand for election, because it was an incredible experience to be a member of the first Youth Parliament. And coming from a very rural area, I've been able to develop my skills in terms of communication. I've met a number of new people and made new friends, so it's a great opportunity. Yes, I'd echo Kai's comments if I'm honest. This is a really cool opportunity to learn more about the political system and to learn how to find your place as a citizen within politics. I think that's been very useful, and it really does help. If you're not sure of your opinion or of your role within politics, then I do think it's a really cool opportunity and you should definitely consider applying. Excellent. We will move on now to questions asked by our audience today. And we have a number of those to get through, so I'll do my best to get through them in the little time we have left. And the first is, and we've already mentioned this to a certain extent, but the question is, what, in your view, is the best way of appealing to and engendering the interest of young people before elections? What media is most effective in terms of ensuring that people do hear those important messages? We've talked about social media, but we've also talked about the problems that can arise from social media in terms of what is fact and what is opinion. So, from your experience, what do you think are the best ways of reaching out to young people and to encourage them to vote in elections? Well, as we've mentioned throughout this debate, the media is a very important resource and one that is very influential indeed. With the parliamentary election that we've just had, it was good to see organisations like the Urdd providing information, and BBC Radio Cymru had a podcast, and I also had a conversation for Lush Cymru on the importance of voting, and Hans created If I Was First Minister, and we could raise young people's issues there. I would say that a strong relationship between media and education could engender interest and provide information, because interest and information will provide a very important balance for anyone who wants to vote and wants to stand for election. But also, I know that the pandemic clearly proved to be problematic in terms of people being able to campaign, but seeing the relationship develop between political parties and schools, if that were to be at all possible, then that would give them an opportunity to show young people that they do count, that their voices are heard, and also they could explain, well, these policies will affect you in such and such a way, and this policy might be important to you, and then education could come in and explain the policy and explain the party's manifestos. I think those are the kinds of things. It's that balance between education and the media would be one of the most important developments for the future, I would say.
Yeah, yn cytuno'n gryf,
Yes, I agree with that. During our 5M campaign, I realized that we needed to meet young people where they are. We can't wait for young people to come to you. That it's not going to happen. You have to go to them. And I love discussing the media. Young people aren't on Facebook, they're on TikTok and Instagram. If you want to discuss politics with young people, go to TikTok, go to Instagram. Just as a joke, we created a TikTok a few weeks ago discussing independence as a topic. And I had some 200 comments with people just discussing their own ideas about an independence campaign. Even if they disagreed, they discussed it, and there's a great deal of energy out there. So if we meet young people where they are, which is TikTok and Instagram, then that's the best opportunity for us to debate and educate. Of course, comment sections are usually quite, but on the 5M Instagram, we had 3,000 people seeing our posts, and people click the save button and return to them. And we created one which was everything you need to know about the election, and that was seen by around 1,000 people, and they saved it, and then they had it available to them. So if we meet young people where they are, again, TikTok and Instagram, then that is the best way for us to educate them about our political system. That answer, Tom, takes us neatly into the second question, namely, how can democracy attract young people? As young people yourselves, what do you think would encourage your friends to engage more with democracy? And young people aren't just going to be encouraged through TikTok, but as you say, it is a very effective way of doing that. But what else do you think would encourage your friends who are already interested in politics and those who aren't? What would encourage them to get involved in democracy and to see the value of voting? Well, it's a tricky one, because I think we have to acknowledge the fact that privilege comes into this, because there are many young people who haven't had the option to not be political because they are forced to face the political system. And with that, I think clearly I do see some strengths in pop culture and art and how that relates to politics, and it is really effective, as Tom said. But I also think it's worth considering how the education system, where literally every young person pretty much does go through in their most formative years, and this is what's going to affect their worldview and how they view politics and the political system. So I think changes to the curriculum and so on are going to make such a difference in terms of the kinds of things that we discuss on a day-to-day basis with our friends. For the majority of young people, much of their time is spent in school, and therefore I think incorporating that education in an effective way is extremely important.
Eto, mae hwnna'n pontio'n dda.
Again, that takes us neatly into the next question. You're ahead of the game here, and that next question is on education. Many young people say that they're not interested in democracy because they say it doesn't affect me, or they don't see how politics and democracy affects them. But being an active citizen is part of the new curriculum. But how do you think political education in schools, how could that education encourage young people to realize that democracy and politics does have an impact upon them? And we've already mentioned this, I know. We hope to see more political education in this new curriculum, but although you've been through school now, I know, but how would you have liked to have seen politics being taught in schools when you were pupils? So how could it have been most effective in terms of educating young people? I think you need local examples. If they see that things have changed because of local politics in their own localities, then I think they take more interest in it. Excellent. Anyone else? Any views on that in terms of how politics should be taught and how young people could get a flavor of democracy for the first time in schools? Personally, I remember we had personal and social education lessons, and I remember for the first 3 years there was no value to it at all. And I know that the Youth Parliament has worked on life skills in the curriculum, and I saw the report, and many of the things mentioned weren't covered in my school education in terms of sex education and what's acceptable in the relationships between boys and girls, or issues around racism, or life skills such as buying a house or getting a mortgage. And the same was true in terms of politics. There was nothing taught really, and I think that is why politics wasn't widely discussed within the school, because if it wasn't taught in school, then some pupils could only discuss those issues at home, and it's difficult to say what the influences from home are. Perhaps the parents don't have the right information, and that's passed on to the children. So as Kai said, it's local influences. For example, in the Nantlla Valley, it wouldn't be a bad thing if an hour or two a week could be put aside to learn about policies and bring in members of the Senedd or members of the Westminster Parliament, such as Siôn Jenkins and Hywel Williams. They could come in and discuss what they've been working on locally and what their vision at a national level is too. And then young people could see that relationship between local and national politics, and also then further afield and look at international politics. And I think I could have learned much more if I'd had that political education and life skills within school too, because to be honest, I learned virtually nothing in those lessons that were supposed to teach me life skills. And just very briefly, if I could jump in, I also think that we need to promote discussions in school in terms of diversity. I'm sure Aleena would agree that my experience as a white person from Cardiff would be very different to the experiences of a person of colour who is a Muslim or is Christian. We have so much diversity, and that's so important. So if within schools, if we can encourage this multicultural discussion, then I think we could see more diversity within our politics. If I could just develop on that and to link it back to this theme of the bridge that we have been discussing this morning, I think it's very important to question what kind of system we have in place today and how we can move that forward. I think it's important to understand how the system was built in the first place. And of course, there are very problematic elements in terms of how that system was constructed. But if we do have that education and that awareness of what kind of system we're working within, then I think it is easier to find the cracks and find the gaps and to consider what kind of change we need to deliver.
Gwych. Wel, dwi ddim wedi cael cyfle i fynd drwy pob
Excellent. Well, I haven't been able to get through all of the questions posed for the panel, so I apologize for that. But I do have a brief statement just to say that we received a number of questions for young people asking about the best way to access political parties at a local level in order to stand as candidates in the next Welsh Youth Parliament election. Just to make this clear, you don't have to be a member of a political party in order to stand in the Welsh Youth Parliament election. You stand as individuals for the Youth Parliament. And as you do so, you'll be asked to provide a brief bio about yourself, as well as presenting the 3 causes that are most important to you. So you don't have to be involved with any political party. You would stand as individuals. So if you're interested, then go for it. Well, our time is up. So may I thank our panelists very much, Lleucu, Talulah, Tom, Aleena and Kai, for your valuable contributions today. And can I thank you very much as a Youth Parliament for inviting me to chair this session. I always enjoy contributing and discussing these issues with you. So thank you all very much. And just before we close, I have a few things to note. As I said, registering to vote in the next Welsh Youth Parliament election is open now, and you can go to the Welsh Youth Parliament website, www.welshyouthparliament.wales, to find more information on how to do that. And the issues of emotional mental health support, littering and plastic waste, and life skills in the curriculum were just some of the issues that were touched upon by the last Youth Parliament. So what do you want to see the next Youth Parliament addressing and taking action on? There will be a link to a brief survey appearing at the end of this event. So please share your views, and you can see that survey on the Youth Parliament website too. So the Youth Parliament is also in the process of launching the candidacy for partner organisations today. So any organisation of any size from any part of Wales can apply to be one of the Youth Parliament's partner organisations for the next Youth Parliament. And again, there's more details on how that can be done on the Youth Parliament website. I won't read the address again because I've done that plenty of times already. And finally, it will be possible for young people between 11 and 18 years of age, the length and breadth of Wales, to put themselves forward as candidates in the next Welsh Youth Parliament election from the 5th of July onwards. And again, there's more details on the Welsh Youth Parliament website. So that's it for today. Thank you again for your company, and I hope I'll have an opportunity to join with you again in the near future. Thank you very much.